The Harrington ballroom glittered with the light of 1,000 candles, their flames reflecting off crystal chandeliers and casting dancing shadows across the silk-clad figures below. March 15th, 1814, marked yet another spring ball in London's endless social season, and Eleanor Ashworth stood in her usual position near the potted palms, her lavender dress of simple cut distinguishing her from the more elaborate gowns swirling past. At 30, she had perfected the art of being present, yet invisible, her spectacles catching the light as she adjusted them for the 100th time that evening, a nervous habit she had developed over 10 seasons of watching others dance. The orchestra played another quadrille, and she observed the patterns of the dancers with the same detached interest she might apply to studying crop rotation schedules for her father's estate. Her fingers traced the smooth pearls at her throat. Her mother's final gift before consumption had claimed her 5 years ago, leaving Eleanor to manage both household and lands while her father retreated into his books. The weight of those years pressed upon her shoulders as heavily as the knowing glances of the matrons who had long since ceased attempting to matchmake on her behalf. She had become a fixture at these events, as unremarkable as the wallpaper, attending only because her younger sister Harriet insisted that hope, however faint, was better than complete surrender. The crowd parted momentarily, revealing a dark figure across the room who seemed to command attention without effort, and Eleanor recognized the notorious Duke of Somerton from the whispers that had followed his recent return to London after years abroad. Frederick Ravenscroft cut an imposing figure even from this distance, his bearing speaking of barely contained energy that set him apart from the more languid gentlemen of the ton. She allowed herself a moment to study him, knowing that men of his rank existed in a sphere as far removed from her own as the stars visible through the tall windows. The music shifted, signaling the approach of 11 o'clock and the final hour of dancing, when Eleanor became aware of Lady Beatrice Montague holding court nearby, her voice carrying with the particular clarity of one who intended to be overheard. "Poor Eleanor Ashworth," Lady Beatrice sighed with false sympathy, her emerald necklace glittering as she leaned closer to her companions. "Still attending every ball, still standing with the wallflowers. 30 and still hoping. Almost tragic, really. One would think she would have accepted her fate by now." The words struck Eleanor with the force of a physical blow, each syllable a reminder of her decade-long vigil in ballrooms just like this one, and she felt her cheeks burn with humiliation as several heads turned to glance at her with pity. The familiar ache of invisibility sharpened into something more acute, and she found herself moving toward the French doors that led to the terrace, desperate for the cool March air and the blessed solitude of the garden beyond, where stars offered silent companionship to those whom society had forgotten. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The cool March air struck Eleanor's heated cheeks like a benediction as she stepped onto the terrace, her gloved fingers gripping the stone balustrade while she fought to compose herself, drawing in deep breaths of night air scented with early spring flowers from the garden below. The tears she had held back in the ballroom threatened to spill now in the safety of solitude, and she blinked rapidly behind her spectacles, refusing to let Lady Beatrice's cruelty reduce her to such a display even in private. The distant strains of a waltz drifted through the French doors, mocking her with its rhythm, meant for couples while she stood alone beneath the stars, her lavender dress inadequate protection against the chill that had nothing to do with temperature. She sensed rather than heard movement behind her, a subtle shift in the air that made her spine straighten, assuming some gossiping matron had followed to witness her humiliation more closely. "I see you managed to escape Lord Rushworth's determined pursuit earlier this evening." A deep male voice observed from the shadows, causing Eleanor to spin around in surprise, her hand flying to her throat where her mother's pearls rested. Frederick Ravenscroft emerged from the darkness like something out of the Gothic novels she secretly adored, his dark evening clothes making him nearly invisible, save for the way moonlight caught on his signet ring and highlighted the sharp planes of his face. She noticed a slight unevenness to his gait, a barely perceptible favoring of his left leg that spoke of some past injury, though it did nothing to diminish his commanding presence. "Your Grace?" she managed, dropping into a curtsy while her mind raced to understand why the Duke of Somerton would seek her out on the terrace, unless he too wished to mock the spinster who still haunted ballrooms at 30. "I observed your rather creative method of avoiding him by the refreshment table," he continued, moving closer with that slight limp, his eyes holding an expression she could not quite decipher in the moonlight. "Claiming sudden fascination with Lady Harrington's portrait collection was inspired, though I suspect the real attraction was the book barely hidden in your reticule." Eleanor's hand moved instinctively to the small bag where Wollstonecraft's treatise indeed rested, her constant companion at these tedious events, though she had thought herself discreet in consulting it during the evening's duller moments. "You were watching me?" she asked, surprise overcoming her usual careful politeness, her wit surfacing despite her emotional vulnerability. "I watch everyone, Miss Ashworth," he replied, his voice carrying a world-weary edge that spoke of too many seasons observing human folly. "It is a habit acquired during years abroad, though I confess you provided more interesting observation than most. A woman who brings philosophy to a ball and refuses to dance with one of the ton's most persistent bores deserves attention." The compliment, if that's what it was, felt different from the usual empty flattery she had endured in her decade of seasons, carrying a weight of genuine observation that made her pulse quicken, even as she reminded herself that men like him did not truly see women like her. "I suppose you heard Lady Beatrice's assessment of my situation," Eleanor said, lifting her chin with a defiance she did not entirely feel. Better to acknowledge the gossip than pretend ignorance. "Actually, I did," he admitted without pretense, moving to stand beside her at the balustrade, his presence warm despite the cool air. "Which is precisely why I followed you out here. I have a proposition, Miss Ashworth. The evening is nearly over. The last dance is beginning, and I find myself curious whether a woman who reads Wollstonecraft and manages an estate might dance as interestingly as she thinks." Eleanor stared at him, certain she had misheard, that this must be some cruel joke designed to provide tomorrow's gossip, because dukes did not ask spinsters to dance, especially not on terraces away from public view. "I do not require your pity, Your Grace," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the trembling in her chest. His response was not what she expected, for instead of protestations or wounded pride, Frederick Ravenscroft laughed, a low, genuine sound that seemed to surprise him as much as her, his dark eyes crinkling at the corners as he regarded her with what appeared to be sincere delight. "Pity, Miss Ashworth? I assure you, pity is the very last thing I feel at this moment. Will you dance with me or not? One dance before the evening ends entirely, here where the stars can witness instead of the gossips inside." The refusal rose to her lips automatically, a decade of self-protection demanding she decline what could only end in humiliation, yet something in his expression, a flicker of what might have been disappointment quickly masked, made her hesitate. "No," she said finally, watching surprise flash across his features, genuine surprise that suggested he was not accustomed to refusal. "No, Your Grace, I will not dance with you." And with that declaration hanging between them like a challenge, Eleanor Ashworth turned to face the notorious Duke of Somerton fully, her spectacles reflecting the moonlight as she waited to see what he would make of being perhaps the first woman in London to refuse him anything. The silence that followed Eleanor's refusal, stretched between them like a taut wire, broken only by the distant strains of the waltz beginning inside, the final dance of the evening that seemed to mock them both with its elegant rhythm. Frederick Ravenscroft regarded her with an expression she had never seen directed at her before, a mixture of genuine intrigue and something that might have been respect, his dark eyes studying her as if she were a particularly fascinating text he had discovered in some forgotten library. "You continue to surprise me, Miss Ashworth," he said finally, his voice carrying a note of what sounded suspiciously like delight. "Though I confess I am curious about your reasoning. Is it my reputation that concerns you, or do you simply not care for dancing?" The question held no wounded pride, only genuine curiosity, and Eleanor found herself relaxing slightly despite her defensive posture, her hands clasped before her to keep them from trembling. "Neither, Your Grace," she replied, lifting her chin with a courage she did not entirely feel. "I simply see no purpose in providing tomorrow's entertainment for the gossips. A duke dancing with a spinster on a darkened terrace would fuel Lady Beatrice's conversation for weeks." He moved closer, his slight limp more pronounced now that she knew to look for it, and she caught the scent of his cologne, something complex and foreign that spoke of his years abroad. "And if I told you that I care nothing for Lady Beatrice's opinions or those of her ilk?" he asked, his voice dropping to a more intimate register that made her pulse quicken despite her resolution. "Then I would say you have the luxury of not caring," Eleanor responded, her wit sharpening as it always did when she felt cornered. "A duke can afford to dismiss society's judgment. A woman of 30 with no fortune and an estate barely holding together cannot." The words hung in the air between them, more honest than she had intended, and she saw something shift in his expression, a recognition that went deeper than mere sympathy. "You manage your family's estate," he said, and it was not a question, but a statement that made her eyes widen behind her spectacles. "I made inquiries," he admitted without apology. "Any woman who can keep Ashworth from complete ruin while her father buries himself in his library deserves more than standing forgotten among the wallflowers." Eleanor stared at him, stunned that anyone had bothered to learn anything about her beyond her unmarried status and age, that this man who commanded attention merely by existing had taken the time to discover what occupied her days. "You made inquiries about me?" she asked, unable to keep the disbelief from her voice. "I make it my business to know about people who interest me," he replied, moving to stand beside her at the balustrade, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him in the cool night air. "And you, Miss Ashworth, have interested me since I saw you smuggle that book into Lady Harrington's ballroom and proceed to read it behind a potted palm." The waltz inside was reaching its crescendo, the music carrying clearly through the French doors, and Frederick turned to face her fully, his expression serious now, despite the slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Dance with me," he said again, but this time it was different, not the casual invitation of before, but something more earnest. Not for them, not for gossip or entertainment, but because I would like to dance with a woman who reads Wollstonecraft and saves estates and has the courage to tell a duke no. He removed his gloves with deliberate movements, tucking them into his pocket before extending his bare hand to her. A gesture so far outside the bounds of propriety that it took her breath away. "One dance, Miss Ashworth, here under the stars where no one can watch or whisper, just you and I and the music. Let me show you that not everyone in that ballroom has forgotten you exist." Eleanor looked at his outstretched hand, her heart hammering against her ribs as she recognized this moment for what it was, a crossroads that would either lead to fresh heartbreak or something she had stopped daring to imagine. The sensible part of her, honed by 10 years of disappointments, screamed at her to refuse again, to return to the safety of her potted palms and books, and the comfortable invisibility she had wrapped around herself like armor. But there was something in his eyes, a loneliness that matched her own despite his title and looks and the way society fawned over him, that made her slowly, tremblingly, peel off her own gloves. The moment her bare palm touched his, skin against skin in a contact that would scandalize anyone who witnessed it, Eleanor felt a jolt of recognition, as if some part of her that had been sleeping for a decade suddenly awakened. He drew her closer, his other hand finding her waist with a certainty that suggested he had done this many times before, yet there was a carefulness to his touch that made her feel precious rather than practiced. The music from inside provided their rhythm as they began to move. There on Lady Harrington's terrace, with the garden maze spread below them and the stars as their only witnesses. And Eleanor discovered that the Duke of Somerton danced exactly as she might have expected, with a controlled grace that accommodated his slight limp and made her feel as if she were floating. For the first time in 10 years, she did not think about her spectacles, or her age, or the plainness of her features, or the fact that her dress was 3 seasons out of fashion. She simply existed in this moment, in the circle of his arms, feeling seen in a way that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. "You dance beautifully," he murmured, his breath warm against her temple. And she might have laughed at the absurdity of it, except that he sounded utterly sincere, as if he truly meant it rather than simply saying what was expected. "Eleanor!" The sharp voice cut through their private world like a blade. And they sprang apart as Lady Harriet Greville burst onto the terrace, her face a study in shock as she took in the scene before her, the Duke of Somerton and her spinster sister standing far too close, their bare hands still touching. "Harriet," Eleanor managed, her voice barely steady as she hastily retrieved her gloves, aware that her cheeks were burning with a heat that had nothing to do with embarrassment and everything to do with the way Frederick's hand had felt against hers. Her sister's eyes darted between them, wide with a combination of disbelief and what might have been hope, before settling on the Duke with the assessing look of a woman who had successfully navigated the marriage mart and knew how to read the signs. Frederick, for his part, seemed utterly unperturbed by the interruption. Bowing to Harriet with perfect propriety despite the decidedly improper situation she had discovered, his dark eyes still holding traces of the warmth that had been directed at Eleanor moments before. "Lady Greville," he said smoothly, "I was just thanking your sister for the dance. She has been most kind to indulge me." The words were perfectly correct, giving away nothing of what had truly transpired. Yet the way he looked at Eleanor as he said them made her heart skip. "Until we meet again, Miss Ashworth," he added, bowing to her as well, and there was a promise in those words that made her tremble, a certainty that this was not an ending, but a beginning she had not dared to hope for. He left them there on the terrace, his slight limp barely noticeable as he strode back into the ballroom, leaving Eleanor to face her sister's stunned expression and the knowledge that her carefully constructed walls had been breached by a man who made inquiries about spinsters and danced with them under the stars, who saw through her invisibility to something beneath that he apparently found worth pursuing. The morning light filtered weakly through the breakfast-room windows as Eleanor pushed her eggs around her plate, having managed perhaps 3 hours of fitful sleep after lying awake replaying every moment of her encounter with the Duke of Somerton, analyzing each word and gesture until she had convinced herself that she had imagined the warmth in his eyes and the promise in his parting words. Harriet sat across from her, practically vibrating with barely contained excitement. Her own breakfast abandoned as she leaned forward with the expression of a hound who had caught a particularly intriguing scent. "Eleanor, you cannot simply sit there pretending nothing extraordinary occurred last night," her sister burst out finally, unable to contain herself any longer. "The Duke of Somerton, the most sought-after man in London, was dancing with you on the terrace, alone, without gloves." The emphasis on the last words made Eleanor wince, remembering all too clearly the feeling of his bare palm against hers, the warmth that had shot through her at the contact. "It was merely a kindness," Eleanor replied, keeping her voice steady through long practice at disappointment. "He likely felt sorry for me after overhearing Lady Beatrice's comments." Harriet made a sound of pure frustration, reaching across the table to grasp Eleanor's hand with the fierce protectiveness that occasionally emerged from beneath her society polish. "Eleanor, men like the Duke of Somerton do not dance with women out of pity, particularly not in such an intimate manner. You clearly do not understand who he is or what his attention means." She paused, her expression shifting to something more serious as she lowered her voice. "He was engaged once, 8 years ago to Lady Lydia Sinclair, the diamond of that season. She threw him over for the Duke of Ashford when he proved wealthier, and Frederick left England entirely afterward, spent years in Italy doing heaven knows what. The gossips say he had numerous affairs with Italian contessas and opera singers, that he became quite wild, hence the nickname of the Rogue Duke." Eleanor absorbed this information, trying to reconcile it with the man who had noticed her book and made inquiries about her estate management, who had danced with her under the stars with a carefulness that suggested something fragile and precious. "He only returned to England recently when his uncle took ill," Harriet continued, warming to her theme. "He inherited the title 3 months ago, and every matchmaking mamma in London has been throwing their daughters at him since. Lady Beatrice has been particularly persistent about her niece, that insipid Miss Carmichael, which might explain her venom toward you last night." Before Eleanor could respond, their father wandered into the breakfast room, his grey hair standing at odd angles and ink stains on his fingers, suggesting he had already been in his library. "Good morning, my dears," he said vaguely, helping himself to toast while simultaneously reading a letter. "Eleanor, Hawkins tells me the southern fields are showing excellent progress with that new rotation method you implemented. Fascinating stuff, really. Oh, and some flowers arrived for you, though I cannot imagine why anyone would send flowers at breakfast time." Eleanor's heart stuttered as Agnes Fleming entered, carrying an elegant arrangement of white roses interspersed with lavender, the scent filling the small room as the housekeeper set them before her with a knowing look that suggested she had her own thoughts about their origin. With trembling fingers, Eleanor extracted the card from among the blooms, aware of Harriet practically climbing across the table to see, and read the brief message written in a bold, masculine hand. "For a woman of reason who deserves more than one dance. S." The S could only stand for Somerton, and Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks as she remembered his promise to meet again, the way he had looked at her as if she were a puzzle he was determined to solve. "Well?" Harriet demanded, having shown remarkable restraint in not snatching the card from Eleanor's hands. "What does it say? Who are they from?" Eleanor passed her the card wordlessly, watching her sister's eyes widen with delight before turning to their father, who was now attempting to butter his toast while still reading, completely oblivious to the drama unfolding at his own breakfast table. "Papa," Harriet said in her most determined voice, "I believe we need to discuss Eleanor's wardrobe situation immediately. She cannot continue attending social functions in gowns from 3 seasons past if the Duke of Somerton is showing interest." Sir Thomas looked up briefly, blinking at them through his spectacles with the confused expression of a man pulled from deeper thoughts. "The Duke of Somerton. Capital fellow. Excellent library, I'm told. Why would Eleanor's wardrobe concern him?" He paused, a thought occurring to him. "Speaking of which, Eleanor, I've been meaning to discuss the drainage issue in the eastern section. Hawkins seems to think we need to invest in new channels before the spring rains worsen." Eleanor opened her mouth to respond about the drainage, grateful for the familiar territory of estate management. But Harriet cut across her with the ruthlessness of a woman on a mission. "Papa, the Duke of Somerton sent Eleanor flowers. He danced with her last night. He is showing a marked interest in her, and we must act accordingly." The words seemed to finally penetrate their father's scholastic fog, and he set down his letter to peer at Eleanor with sudden focus. "Is this true, my dear, the Duke of Somerton?" When Eleanor nodded, he smiled with genuine pleasure, reaching over to pat her hand with absent affection. "How wonderful! Your mother would have been so pleased. She always said you would find someone who appreciated your intelligence, though I must admit I never expected a duke." "Well, well, I suppose this means I should pay more attention to these social matters Harriet is always nattering about." Agnes Fleming, who had remained in the room ostensibly arranging the flowers but actually gathering intelligence with the efficiency of a seasoned campaigner, caught Eleanor's eye with a warm smile that spoke volumes about her own thoughts on the matter. "Shall I prepare the blue drawing-room for callers this afternoon, miss?" she asked with studied innocence. One never knows who might arrive during calling hours. Eleanor felt the walls of her carefully constructed defense beginning to crumble under the combined assault of her family's hope and the tangible evidence of the flowers before her. Their scent a constant reminder of a duke who noticed wallflowers and danced with them in moonlight. "I believe I will work on the accounts this morning," she said, trying to restore some normalcy to a world that suddenly felt tilted on its axis. But even as she spoke, her fingers traced the edge of the card with its bold handwriting, and she wondered if the Duke of Somerton truly meant to call, if the promise in his eyes had been real or merely another illusion to add to her collection of might-have-beens. The clock in the hallway had just chimed 3 when Agnes Fleming appeared in the drawing-room doorway, her usually composed features betraying a hint of excitement as she announced that His Grace the Duke of Somerton had arrived, and Eleanor felt her heart leap so violently she was certain it must be visible through the modest afternoon dress Harriet had insisted she wear instead of her usual practical attire. 4 days had passed since the Harrington ball, 4 days of jumping at every knock upon the door, of trying to concentrate on estate accounts while the scent of white roses and lavender filled her small study, of telling herself repeatedly that dukes did not actually court spinsters, despite what romantic novels might suggest. Yet here he was, crossing the threshold of their modest drawing-room, with the same controlled grace she remembered from the terrace, his dark eyes immediately finding hers with an intensity that made her fingers tremble as she set aside the ledger she had been pretending to review. "Miss Ashworth," he said, bowing formally, though his eyes held that same warmth she had glimpsed under the stars. "I hope I find you well. Lady Greville," he added, acknowledging Harriet, who sat primly on the settee, practically vibrating with the effort of maintaining proper decorum when Eleanor knew she wanted nothing more than to interrogate them both. The drawing-room, with its worn turkey carpet and furniture that spoke of better times, had never felt smaller than it did with Frederick's presence filling it, and Eleanor was acutely aware of the contrast between their modest circumstances and what his own home must be like. "Your Grace," she managed, rising to curtsy and noticing with dismay the ink stains on her fingers from her morning's work, evidence of the practical life she led so far removed from the elegant ladies he must typically associate with. If he noticed the ink or the shabby gentility of their surroundings, he gave no sign, instead moving to examine the small bookshelf near the window with what appeared to be genuine interest, his fingers trailing along the spines with the reverence of a true bibliophile. "Virgil, Aristotle, Smith's Wealth of Nations," he murmured, glancing back at her with raised brows. "And unless I am mistaken, that appears to be Sinclair's Code of Agriculture. Rather unexpected reading for a drawing-room." The challenge in his tone was gentle, almost teasing, and Eleanor found herself responding before she could think better of it. Only unexpected if one believes women incapable of understanding anything beyond fashion plates and Gothic novels, Your Grace. The words hung in the air for a moment, before his face broke into a genuine smile, the first she had seen from him, transforming his sardonic features into something that made her breath catch. "Precisely the response I hoped for," he said, moving away from the bookshelf to take the chair Harriet indicated, though his attention remained fixed on Eleanor. "I confess I noticed your account ledger when I entered. Are those the Ashworth estate books?" Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, embarrassed to be caught with such mundane work during calling hours. But there was something in his expression that looked almost like admiration that made her lift her chin as she replied, "They are. I was reviewing the quarterly expenses. The spring planting requires careful budgeting." Instead of the polite dismissal or bored acknowledgement she expected, Frederick leaned forward with obvious interest, and the next several minutes passed in a surprisingly engaging discussion of agricultural economics, with Eleanor gradually forgetting her self-consciousness as she explained their new crop rotation system and the drainage improvements she hoped to implement. "Remarkable," he said when she paused, suddenly aware she had been speaking for quite some time about subjects that must surely bore a duke. "I spent considerable time on my estate in Italy, a villa near Florence, and implemented similar improvements, though I confess my steward did most of the actual planning while He paused, something shadowing his eyes briefly. "While I spent my days in the library, reading everything I could find, trying to forget England existed." The admission was unexpectedly personal, a crack in the polished facade he presented to the world, and Eleanor found herself leaning forward slightly, drawn by this glimpse of vulnerability from a man who seemed so entirely self-possessed. "You must miss it," she said softly. "Italy, I mean. The art, the history, the sunshine." His smile this time was rueful, tinged with memory. "I do, though I discovered one cannot run from oneself indefinitely, no matter how beautiful the setting. 3 years I spent in that library, reading Dante in the original Italian, convincing myself I preferred solitude." He reached into his coat then, withdrawing a small wrapped package that he extended toward her with an almost diffident air that seemed at odds with his usual confidence. "Which reminds me, I brought you something. A small token, perhaps presumptuous of me, but when I saw it, I thought of our discussion of literature on the terrace." Eleanor's hands shook slightly as she unwrapped the package under Harriet's eager gaze, revealing a beautifully bound volume of Dante's Inferno in Italian, its leather cover soft with age and gilt lettering still bright against the dark binding. "Your Grace," she breathed, running her fingers reverently over the cover, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of the gift, by the fact that he had remembered their brief conversation and acted upon it. "It's beautiful, but I couldn't possibly—" "Please," he said, his voice dropping to a more intimate register despite Harriet's presence. "It has sat on my shelf long enough. I would like to think of it being read and appreciated rather than gathering dust. Perhaps," he added with a slight smile, "you might tell me your thoughts on Dante's use of terza rima when I call again, if I may be permitted to call again." The question hung in the air between them, weighted with more significance than a simple social nicety, and Eleanor found herself nodding before she could second-guess herself, her fingers still caressing the book's cover as if it were something precious beyond its obvious value. "I would enjoy that," she said, meeting his eyes directly, surprised by her own boldness, but encouraged by the warmth she found there. "Very much." Rain had begun to patter against the windows, preventing the garden walk that might have been expected, but the conversation flowed with surprising ease, touching on books and ideas, travels and dreams, with Harriet contributing occasionally, but mostly watching with barely concealed delight as her sister emerged from her shell under Frederick's genuine interest and attention. When he finally rose to leave after the proper half-hour had elapsed, Eleanor felt as if mere minutes had passed, and she clutched the Dante volume to her chest as he bowed over her hand, his fingers pressing hers briefly in a gesture that was entirely proper, yet somehow managed to convey volumes. "Until next time, Miss Ashworth," he said, and there was a promise in those words that made her believe, for the first time in 10 years, that perhaps she was not as invisible as she had believed herself to be. That perhaps a duke might truly see something in a spinster who read agricultural treatises and managed estates and had ink stains on her fingers from doing the work that kept her family afloat. The card-room at Lady Pembroke's soiree hummed with the particular tension that accompanied high stakes and higher gossip, the green baize tables illuminated by branched candelabra that cast dancing shadows across the players' faces as Eleanor tried to concentrate on the cards in her hand rather than the fact that the Duke of Somerton sat directly across from her as her whist partner, his presence commanding the attention of the entire room despite his apparent focus on the game. She had not expected to see him here tonight, having convinced herself over the past week that his visit to their modest drawing-room had been a momentary aberration, a duke's passing fancy that would fade as quickly as it had appeared. Yet here he was, having sought her out the moment she entered the room with Harriet, and claimed her as his partner with a proprietary air that set tongues wagging behind fans. Lady Beatrice Montague sat at the adjacent table, her emerald necklace catching the light with each movement as she dealt cards with practiced efficiency, while her eyes tracked every interaction between Eleanor and Frederick with the calculating gaze of a cat watching mice, her thin lips pursed in disapproval whenever she caught Eleanor's eye. "Your play, Miss Ashworth," Frederick prompted gently, his voice carrying that particular warmth she had come to recognize over their few encounters, and Eleanor forced herself to focus on the game, playing her card with fingers that trembled only slightly as she became aware of how many eyes were upon them. How many people were watching the spinster and the duke with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright disbelief. Lord Philip Langdon, Frederick's companion at their table, observed the proceedings with barely concealed amusement, his fair features arranged in an expression of polite interest that didn't quite hide the speculative glances he kept directing between his friend and Eleanor, as if trying to solve a particularly intriguing puzzle. The hand progressed with Eleanor gradually relaxing into the familiar rhythm of the game, her natural strategic mind asserting itself as she and Frederick fell into an easy partnership, communicating through glances and small gestures with an efficiency that spoke of compatibility beyond the card table, their victories accumulating as naturally as their conversation flowed between hands. "Such charity, Your Grace." Lady Beatrice's voice cut through the comfortable atmosphere like a blade through silk, her words pitched to carry to the surrounding tables as she rose from her seat to approach them during the break between rubbers, her smile sharp as the diamonds at her throat. "How kind of you to partner with poor Miss Ashworth, though I suppose at her age one must take whatever attention one can garner, however fleeting." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and Eleanor felt heat flood her cheeks as the room seemed to hold its collective breath waiting to see how the Duke would respond to such a blatant insult disguised as sympathy, her hands clenching in her lap as the familiar pain of public humiliation washed over her. Frederick set down his cards with deliberate precision, his dark eyes taking on a dangerous glint that Eleanor had not seen before, as he regarded Lady Beatrice with the kind of cold assessment one might direct at an particularly unpleasant insect, his voice when he spoke carrying enough ice to frost the windows despite the warmth of the room. "I find it curious, Lady Beatrice, how those who possess the least often feel compelled to comment on the worth of others," he said, his tone conversational but edged with steel. "Miss Ashworth's company is both sought and valued by those capable of recognizing intelligence, wit, and genuine character over the shallow trappings that seem to impress the merely decorative members of our society." Lord Langdon coughed suddenly, covering what sounded suspiciously like a laugh as Lady Beatrice's face flushed an unbecoming shade of red, her mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, as she processed the fact that the Duke of Somerton had just delivered a crushing set-down in defense of a spinster, the social implications rippling through the room like waves on a pond. "Your Grace," Eleanor began, mortification and something else, something warmer and more dangerous, warring in her chest as she witnessed this public defense of her worth, unsure whether to feel grateful or humiliated that she needed defending at all. "I appreciate your kindness, but—" He turned to her then, his expression softening as he took in her distress, and to her amazement he smiled, that sardonic curve of lips that she was beginning to recognize meant he was about to say something that would upend her carefully ordered world. "Kindness has nothing to do with it, Miss Ashworth," he said, his voice pitched for her ears, though he made no effort to prevent others from overhearing. "I merely state facts, though I confess I spoke not in your defense, but in my own, as Lady Beatrice's implications reflect poorly on my judgment, and I find I am rather protective of my reputation for excellent taste in all things, particularly in my choice of companions." The crowd began to disperse, Lady Beatrice retreating with what dignity she could muster while the other players returned to their tables. Though the whispers continued to circulate like autumn leaves on the wind, and Eleanor found herself being led by Frederick to a quieter corner of the room where a window alcove provided some semblance of privacy. "You need not have done that," she said quietly, looking up at him with eyes that burned with unshed tears, not of sadness, but of a complex emotion she could not name. "I am quite accustomed to Lady Beatrice's barbs. They have lost their sting after all these years." His hand brushed hers where it rested on the windowsill, the brief contact sending sensation shooting up her arm as he studied her face with an intensity that made her want to both flee and move closer, his voice rough with something that sounded like anger, though she sensed it was not directed at her. "That you have grown accustomed to such treatment does not make it acceptable," he said firmly. "You deserve to be seen, Miss Ashworth, truly seen and valued for who you are, not dismissed by those too blind to recognize worth when it stands before them in a lavender dress, and speaks with more intelligence than half the House of Lords." The reference to the Harrington ball, to that first night when he had seen her as no one else had in 10 years, made her breath catch as she realized that this was not charity or pity or the whim of a bored aristocrat, but something else entirely. Something that terrified her even as it made her heart race with possibilities she had thought forever closed to her. The morning sun cast long shadows across the freshly turned earth of the Ashworth estate as Eleanor strode purposefully between the furrows, her practical brown dress already bearing traces of soil at the hem, while she gestured emphatically to the group of workers gathered around her, explaining the new drainage system that would transform this perpetually soggy corner of their land into productive acreage, her voice carrying the authority that came from years of managing every aspect of the property since her mother's death. She had not expected visitors this morning, had specifically chosen to return to Hertfordshire for the spring planting, precisely because it offered respite from the London season and the confusing emotions that a certain duke had awakened in her carefully ordered life, which was why the sight of Frederick Ravenscroft himself riding up the lane on a magnificent black stallion made her freeze mid-sentence, her hand still raised in illustration of the gradient needed for proper water flow. "Continue with the northern section as we discussed, Mr. Hendricks," she managed to tell her foreman, acutely aware of her mud-caked boots and the wisps of hair escaping from her practical chignon as Frederick dismounted with that easy grace that seemed so at odds with the slight limp she had noticed during their dance, his presence here on her land feeling both thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. "Miss Ashworth," he said, approaching with a smile that suggested he found her current state not shocking, but rather delightful. "I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, I was visiting Lord Pemberton's estate to inspect some horses he has for sale, and I couldn't resist the opportunity to see the agricultural innovations you spoke of so passionately in London." The excuse was transparent enough to make her cheeks warm, Lord Pemberton's estate being a good 5 miles out of the way if he were truly returning to London. But there was something in his expression as he surveyed her domain, taking in the orderly fields and well-maintained buildings with genuine interest, that made her lift her chin with pride rather than embarrassment. "Your timing is fortuitous, Your Grace," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice as she gestured toward the drainage work. "We're implementing a new system based on the principles in Sinclair's Code, though I suspect you didn't truly come to discuss agricultural drainage." His laugh was rich and genuine, transforming his usually sardonic features as he fell into step beside her, apparently unconcerned about the morning dew soaking through his impeccably polished hessians, and Eleanor found herself relaxing incrementally as they walked toward the ancient oak that had stood sentinel over the Ashworth lands for centuries. "You caught me," he admitted, his voice carrying a rueful honesty that made her heart skip. "Though I confess I am genuinely interested in your work here. In London, you seemed—" He paused, searching for words. "Constrained. Here, you're entirely yourself." The observation was so perceptive it took her breath away, and she found herself speaking before she could think better of it, the words tumbling out as they stood beneath the spreading branches of the oak tree, its new leaves casting dappled shadows across his face. "In London, I am the spinster sister, the curiosity who reads too much and speaks of inappropriate subjects. Here, I am simply Eleanor, managing the land that has been in my family for generations, keeping us from ruin through careful planning and hard work." Something shifted in his expression then, a deepening of the intensity she had glimpsed on the terrace at the Harrington ball, and he reached out to brush a strand of hair from her face, with a tenderness that made her breath catch in her throat. "You are never simply anything," he said quietly, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her feel exposed and seen in ways that both thrilled and terrified her. "Though I understand the feeling of being different people in different worlds. In Italy, I could be Frederick, just a man among his books and vineyards. In England, I must be Somerton, the Duke who disappointed everyone by refusing to marry appropriately and produce heirs on schedule." The bitterness in his voice when he spoke of expectations made her forget her own self-consciousness, and she found herself reaching out instinctively to touch his arm, feeling the tension in the muscles beneath the fine wool of his coat. "Is that why you stayed away so long?" she asked softly, remembering Harriet's gossip about the broken engagement, the scandal that had driven him abroad, though she didn't voice these details aloud. His hand covered hers where it rested on his arm, the warmth of his touch sending sensation spiraling through her as he gazed out across the fields with eyes that saw something far beyond the neat furrows and sprouting crops, his voice rough when he finally spoke. "I stayed away because I convinced myself I preferred solitude to the risk of caring again. I told myself that books and beauty were enough, that I didn't need—" He turned to look at her then, something raw and vulnerable in his expression that made her heart ache. "I didn't think I would ever meet someone who could make me want to try again." The admission hung between them in the morning air, heavy with significance, and Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes as she recognized the gift he was offering her, this glimpse behind the sardonic mask he showed the world, this admission of wounds that matched her own in different ways. "I understand," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion as she thought of all the years she had convinced herself that invisibility was safety, that being overlooked was better than being seen and found wanting. "I've spent so long believing I was meant to be alone that wanting more was foolish for someone like me. Sometimes I fear I've forgotten how to hope for anything beyond the next harvest, the next quarter's accounts balanced. His fingers tightened on hers, and she realized they were standing closer now, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, smell the leather and sandalwood scent that clung to him, feel the warmth radiating from his body in the cool morning air. "Then perhaps," he said softly, his free hand coming up to cup her cheek with infinite gentleness, "we might remember together, if you would allow me that honor." The moment stretched between them, fragile and perfect, until the distant sound of Agnes Fleming calling from the house about luncheon broke the spell, and Eleanor stepped back with cheeks burning, though she didn't release his hand as she led him toward the manor, her heart singing with possibilities she had thought forever closed to her. The golden afternoon light slanted through the tall windows of the Ashworth Library, casting warm patches across the worn Persian carpet and illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny golden coins as Eleanor led Frederick into her sanctuary, her heart beating rapidly at the intimacy of sharing this most private space with him. These walls that had witnessed her solitary hours of reading and writing when the rest of the world deemed her invisible and forgotten. "This is my favorite room in the house," she said softly, gesturing toward the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves that lined 3 walls, their contents a hodgepodge of leather-bound volumes, agricultural treatises, novels her mother had loved, and the journals where she secretly poured out her thoughts on everything from crop rotation to the rights of women, though she had never shared that particular secret with anyone. Frederick moved through the space with a reverence that made her throat tight, his fingers trailing along the spines of books as if greeting old friends, pausing occasionally to pull out a volume and examine it with the kind of careful attention that told her he understood what these books meant to her, how they had been her companions through years of loneliness and disappointment. "You have Cobbett's Cottage Economy," he observed with evident delight. "And is that Sinclair's Code of Agriculture? I tried to obtain a copy in Rome but had no luck." His genuine enthusiasm for her agricultural texts, the very books that made most of society laugh at her behind their fans, sent warmth spreading through her chest as she moved to her writing desk by the window, her hand resting on the stack of papers there before she could think better of it. "I have something of a confession," she heard herself saying, the words tumbling out before she could stop them, perhaps emboldened by his easy acceptance of her peculiarities. "I don't just read about agricultural reform. I write about it." She picked up the latest edition of the Farmer's Register, her hands trembling slightly as she opened it to the essay on innovative drainage techniques signed by E.A. Ashford, watching his face carefully as understanding dawned in his dark eyes. The silence stretched between them for what felt like an eternity before he set down the journal with infinite care and looked at her with an expression of such profound admiration that she felt tears prick at her eyes, unaccustomed as she was to being seen, truly seen, for who she really was beneath the spinster facade society had assigned her. "You're E.A. Ashford," he said, wonder coloring his voice as he stepped closer. "I've read your essays. Philip's estate manager swears by your method for preventing soil erosion. Do you realize how revolutionary your ideas are?" The fact that he had read her work, that her words had traveled beyond this room to influence estates she had never seen, overwhelmed her so completely that she sank into the window seat, her spectacles fogging slightly as she struggled to process this unprecedented validation. If anyone discovered that E.A. Ashford was actually a woman, and an unmarried one at that, I would be ruined, she said quietly, voicing the fear that kept her awake at night whenever she sent off another essay under her masculine pseudonym. "They barely tolerate my interest in estate management as it is. If they knew I was presuming to instruct men on agricultural matters—" Frederick crossed the room in 3 quick strides, kneeling before her with a grace that belied his slight limp, his hands capturing hers where they twisted in her lap, the warmth of his touch grounding her in the moment as he looked up at her with fierce intensity. "Your secret is safe with me," he said firmly, his thumbs stroking over her knuckles in a gesture so tender it made her breath catch. "Though I confess, I selfishly hope that someday you might write under your own name, that the world might know the brilliant mind behind these innovations. You have a gift, Eleanor. That you've been forced to hide it is a tragedy, but that you've persevered despite the obstacles." He paused, seeming to search for words adequate to express what he saw in her, and Eleanor found herself leaning forward, drawn by the magnetic pull of his admiration and something deeper, something that had been building between them since that first dance on the terrace. "Most people see only what they expect to see," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion as she thought of all the years she had hidden this part of herself. All the times she had bitten her tongue in drawing rooms when men spouted nonsense about farming techniques she had studied extensively. "But you see me." The late afternoon sun painted his features in shades of gold and amber as he rose slightly, bringing their faces level, his hand coming up to cup her cheek with infinite gentleness as he spoke words that would echo in her heart long after this golden afternoon had faded into memory. "I see a woman of remarkable intelligence and courage," he said softly, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made the rest of the world fade away. "A woman who has spent years nurturing not just her family's land, but knowledge itself, who writes with passion and precision about subjects that matter, who deserves to be celebrated rather than hidden." Sir Thomas chose that moment to wander into the library, blinking owlishly at the tableau before him, and Frederick rose smoothly to his feet, though he kept hold of Eleanor's hand as her father peered at them through his spectacles with mild bewilderment. "Ah, Somerton, still here, are you? Excellent, excellent. Eleanor, my dear, Mrs. Fleming mentioned something about tea. You know how she fusses." He wandered out again without waiting for a response, apparently finding nothing unusual in a duke holding his spinster daughter's hand in their library, and Eleanor found herself laughing, actually laughing, at the absurdity of it all. "I should go," Frederick said reluctantly as the shadows began to lengthen across the floor, though he made no move to release her hand. "But I'll see you at the Lennox ball next week. I find myself quite desperately hoping you'll save me a dance. Perhaps even the first one, if you're feeling particularly bold." The promise in his words, the implication that he wanted to claim her publicly in the most fashionable ballroom of the season, sent a thrill of terror and excitement through her as she nodded, not trusting her voice, and watched him bow over her hand with courtly grace before departing, leaving her alone in her sanctuary with the echo of his admiration and the terrifying, wonderful possibility that she might finally step out of the shadows and into the light of being truly, fully seen. The afternoon light filtering through the tall windows of Frederick's study cast long shadows across the scattered maps of Italy that covered nearly every surface, their edges weighted down with books and the occasional crystal paperweight, as Lord Philip Langdon lounged in the leather chair opposite the desk, swirling the brandy in his glass while studying his friend with the kind of penetrating gaze that had made him invaluable during their shared years of exile on the continent. "You're actually serious about the Ashworth woman?" Philip observed, his tone carrying more curiosity than censure as he watched Frederick carefully inscribe something in the frontispiece of an obviously precious leather-bound volume, the Duke's usual sardonic mask nowhere in evidence as he concentrated on his task with an intensity that spoke of deeper emotions than he had displayed in the 8 years since Lady Lydia Sinclair had shattered his world. "Eleanor," Frederick corrected quietly, setting down his pen and looking up at his oldest friend with eyes that held both determination and a vulnerability that Philip had thought permanently extinguished. "Her name is Eleanor, and yes, I am entirely serious." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of all the years Frederick had sworn off emotional entanglements, all the carefully constructed walls he had built around his heart after Lydia had broken their engagement mere weeks before their wedding, choosing the wealthier Duke of Clarence over the man who had loved her with the passionate intensity of youth. "You do realize what society will say," Philip continued, though his tone was gentle rather than warning, understanding perhaps better than anyone what those years of self-imposed angst had cost his friend. The way Frederick had buried himself in books and beauty rather than risk the devastating pain of betrayal again. A duke marrying a 30-year-old spinster who reads agricultural treatises and manages her own estates? Lady Beatrice has already been making inquiries about Miss Ashworth's circumstances, and you know how vicious she can be when she scents a scandal. Frederick rose from his desk and moved to the window, gazing out at the bustling London street below, while his fingers unconsciously found the signet ring he had worn through all his travels, the one piece of his ducal identity he had never been able to abandon completely, despite his best efforts to forget who he had been before Lydia taught him that love was merely another word for transaction in their glittering world. "Then society can go hang," he said with quiet ferocity, turning back to face Philip with an expression that mingled defiance with something softer, more hopeful than his friend had seen in nearly a decade. "Eleanor sees me, Philip. Not the title, not the wealth, not even the scandalous duke who fled to Italy rather than face the ton's pity. She sees Frederick, the man who reads Dante in the original Italian and debates agricultural methods with genuine interest, who finds more joy in a good book than in all the empty pleasures London has to offer." Philip set down his glass and leaned forward, studying his friend with new understanding as Frederick returned to the desk, picking up the Dante volume with hands that trembled slightly with the weight of what he was acknowledging, not just to Philip, but to himself. "When Lydia left me for Clarence, I thought I understood what it meant to be invisible," Frederick continued, his voice rough with remembered pain as he traced the gilt lettering on the book's cover. "I thought I knew what it was to be seen only for what I represented, rather than who I was. But Eleanor, she has lived with true invisibility for 10 years, overlooked and dismissed, reduced to a figure of pity or amusement. And yet she has retained a brilliance, a warmth, a fierce intelligence that humbles me. She makes me want to be worthy of being seen by her." The confession seemed to surprise Frederick himself, as if speaking the words aloud had crystallized feelings he had been afraid to examine too closely, and Philip watched as his friend's expression shifted from vulnerability to determination, the kind of steel-spined resolve that had carried him through those dark years abroad when everyone had expected him to return within months, properly chastened and ready to marry appropriately. "I'm going to court her properly," Frederick declared, returning to his seat and picking up his pen once more to complete the inscription in the Dante. "I'm going to show her that what we have is real, that she deserves to be cherished, celebrated, chosen first rather than overlooked. And if society objects, if Lady Beatrice and her ilk try to interfere—" His smile turned sharp, dangerous in a way that reminded Philip why Frederick had survived and even thrived during their more adventurous years on the continent. "Well, I've faced worse than gossiping matrons and emerged victorious. Eleanor is worth fighting for. Worth any amount of scandal or social censure." Philip raised his glass in a silent toast, recognizing the return of the man his friend had been before betrayal and heartbreak had driven him into exile, though tempered now with a maturity and depth that made this attachment to the overlooked Miss Ashworth seem less like folly and more like the kind of destiny that only revealed itself to those brave enough to look beyond society's narrow definitions of worth and value. "Then I suggest you prepare for battle," Philip said with a wry smile. because Lady Beatrice was quite pointed in her questions about Miss Ashworth's family circumstances at the Pemberton card party, and we both know she has never forgiven you for refusing her daughter's rather obvious attempts at securing your interest last season. If you mean to claim Miss Ashworth publicly at the Lennox ball, you should expect resistance. Frederick sealed the Dante carefully, his movements deliberate and controlled, even as anticipation coursed through him at the thought of seeing Eleanor again, of watching her eyes light up when she discovered the inscription he had penned in Italian, a private message between two souls who had found in each other an unexpected recognition, an answer to loneliness neither had thought to escape. "Let them resist," he said quietly, his dark eyes holding a promise that made Philip grateful they were on the same side. "Eleanor has been invisible long enough. It's time she was seen for the remarkable woman she is, and I intend to ensure that happens, whatever the cost." The chandeliers of the Lennox ballroom cast their diamond brilliance across the assembled cream of London society, transforming the vast space into a glittering jewel box where Eleanor stood near the refreshment table in her new gown of deep blue silk, the fabric whispering against her skin like a promise as she tried to calm her racing heart, aware that hundreds of eyes had already noted her transformation from the usual lavender and grey to this rich sapphire that Harriet had insisted brought out the warmth in her complexion, though Eleanor suspected no amount of silk could truly transform a 30-year-old spinster into anything society would deem worthy of notice, except that Frederick had been watching her from the moment she entered, his dark eyes finding hers across the crowded floor with an intensity that made her fingers tremble against her fan. And now he was moving through the crowd with deliberate purpose, ignoring the attempts of various young ladies to catch his attention, his path as direct as an arrow toward where she stood frozen between hope and terror. The orchestra just beginning to tune for the first dance as he reached her, bowing with that particular grace that made her breath catch every time. And then he was extending his hand, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden hush that fell around them, as he said, "Miss Ashworth, would you honor me with the first dance?" The words seemed to echo in the vast space as Eleanor became acutely aware of the collective intake of breath from those near enough to witness this unprecedented breach of protocol. A duke choosing a known spinster for the opening dance, when at least a dozen eligible young ladies waited with barely concealed eagerness for such an honor, and she could feel the weight of society's judgment pressing down upon her even as she placed her trembling hand in his, allowing him to lead her onto the floor, where they stood alone for a moment that stretched like eternity before other couples began to join them, though she could hear the whispers spreading like wildfire through the ballroom, a susurration of shock and speculation that threatened to overwhelm her until Frederick's hand found the small of her back, his touch grounding her in the present as the music began, a waltz that would force them into an intimacy that proper young ladies were barely permitted, and spinsters certainly shouldn't claim. Yet here she was in his arms, moving through the familiar steps as if they had danced together 100 times before, his hand warm through the silk of her gown, his eyes never leaving hers even as she sensed the hundreds of gazes following their movement around the floor, and for a moment she could almost forget the impropriety of it all, lost in the sensation of being held, being chosen, being seen in this most public of forums, until Lady Beatrice's voice cut through the music like a blade, carrying with theatrical clarity as she declared to her companion, "How charitable of His Grace to take pity on poor Miss Ashworth, though one does wonder at the nature of such sudden attention, as I've heard the most interesting rumors about his true intentions. Something about a wager among the gentlemen at White's regarding whether even a duke could make a spinster marriageable." And Eleanor felt her body stiffen in Frederick's arms as the poisonous words sank in, her step faltering, as doubt crashed over her like a cold wave, all her deepest fears crystallizing in that moment as she looked up at Frederick's face, seeing the shock and pain that flashed across his features before his expression hardened into something dangerous. But the damage was done. The seed of doubt planted as Eleanor heard herself whisper, "Is this real, or am I merely your entertainment?" The question hung between them as the music continued. Other dancers swirling past in a blur of color and motion, while Eleanor waited for his answer, seeing the muscle jump in his jaw as he drew breath to respond. But before he could speak, the dance brought them to the edge of the floor, where Lady Beatrice stood with her coterie of followers, their faces alight with malicious interest. And suddenly Eleanor couldn't breathe, couldn't bear another moment under the weight of those knowing smirks and whispered speculations. And as the music reached its crescendo, she pulled away from Frederick's embrace, her mother's pearls cold against her throat as she fled through the crowd, dimly aware of him calling her name, but unable to stop, unable to face the possibility that these magical weeks had been nothing more than a cruel game, that she had allowed herself to hope only to be crushed once again by the reality that women like her were never chosen, never truly seen, merely used as pawns in whatever games amused the ton. And as she pushed through the ballroom doors into the cooler air beyond, she caught a glimpse of herself in one of the Lennox famous mirrors, seeing not the transformative power of blue silk, but the same invisible woman she had always been, dressed in finery that couldn't disguise the fundamental truth that she would always be overlooked, would always be the spinster who had dared to dream beyond her station, and the tears she had held back through years of disappointment finally threatened to fall as she stumbled toward the garden, seeking darkness and solitude to nurse this fresh wound that cut deeper than all the others, because this time, for just a few precious weeks, she had actually believed. The fountain's gentle cascade provided the only sound in the Lennox garden as Eleanor sank onto the cold stone bench, her breath coming in ragged gasps while tears threatened to spill over the careful composure she had maintained for so many years, the blue silk of her gown pooling around her like water in the moonlight, as she pressed her palms against her burning cheeks, trying to make sense of the maelstrom of emotions that Lady Beatrice's cruel words had unleashed, when footsteps on the gravel path made her stiffen, knowing without looking that Frederick had followed her, had tracked her to this secluded corner where the scent of night-blooming jasmine hung heavy in the air, and she heard him pause several feet away, giving her the choice to acknowledge him or send him away. But she found herself unable to speak, unable to even lift her head as he moved closer, the bench shifting slightly as he sat beside her, not touching. Just present in a way that made her aware of every breath, every heartbeat, until his voice came low and rough, with barely controlled emotion. "Eleanor, please look at me." And when she finally raised her eyes to his face, she saw not the polished Duke, but a man stripped raw, his dark eyes blazing with a combination of fury and pain that made her chest tighten as he continued, "What Lady Beatrice said was a vicious lie designed to wound us both, and I need you to know, need you to understand that I have no interest in games, Miss Ashworth. I am long past playing them." His hands clenched into fists on his thighs, as if he was physically restraining himself from reaching for her. "I know what it is to be invisible, Eleanor, to be seen only as a source of amusement or an object of pity, and I would never, could never inflict that pain on another soul, least of all you." And something in his voice, a rawness that spoke of old wounds barely healed, made her believe him even as her own pain remained fresh and bleeding. 8 years ago, I was the one left standing alone while society whispered and laughed behind their fans, deemed not wealthy enough, not important enough to hold the woman I thought loved me. And I fled to Italy, not out of adventure, but out of cowardice, unable to bear being reduced to a cautionary tale for young men who dared to believe themselves worthy of love, his confession hanging between them like a bridge across the chasm of her doubt. and Eleanor felt her shawl slip from her shoulders, barely registering when he retrieved it, his fingers brushing against her bare skin as he settled the soft fabric back in place with a tenderness that made her throat close with emotion. "You asked if this was real," he continued, his voice steadier now but no less intense. "And I tell you, it is the most real thing I have felt in 8 years, this connection between us that defies every rule society would impose, every expectation of what a duke should want or whom a spinster should accept. And if you will permit me, I would like to court you properly, formally, with all the honor and respect you deserve, but have been denied for far too long." The distant strains of another waltz drifting from the ballroom like a ghost of what they had shared before Lady Beatrice's poison, and Eleanor found herself trembling as she whispered, "I'm afraid to hope again, Frederick. Afraid that wanting something, someone, will only lead to greater pain when I'm inevitably reminded of my place," her voice breaking on the admission of a fear she had never spoken aloud, not even to herself in the darkest hours of her many lonely nights. And she saw his expression soften, his hand moving slowly to cover hers where it rested on the bench between them, the touch electric even through her gloves as he said quietly, "Then we shall be afraid together, for I too am terrified of what I feel for you, of how thoroughly you have disturbed the careful emptiness I cultivated for so long. But I find that the prospect of returning to that emptiness is far more frightening than the risk of hoping for something extraordinary." And as Eleanor looked into his eyes, seeing her own vulnerabilities reflected there alongside a determination that made her pulse quicken, she felt something shift inside her chest, a door long barred beginning to open as she turned her hand beneath his, letting their fingers intertwine in a gesture that felt more intimate than their dance had been, more binding than any words, as she breathed her consent into the jasmine-scented darkness, granting him permission to court her, to prove that what sparked between them was worth the risk of believing once more that she might be truly seen, truly chosen, truly loved. The morning light filtered through the drawing-room windows as Eleanor carefully arranged the rare botanical texts Frederick had brought her the previous day, their leather bindings still carrying the faint scent of his cologne as she traced the gilt lettering with fingers that trembled slightly at the memory of how their hands had brushed when he presented them, just one of many such moments that had filled the past 2 weeks since that night in the Lennox garden, when she had granted him permission to court her properly. And true to his word, he had appeared at her doorstep each day at precisely 3 o'clock, sometimes bringing gifts like these precious books or exotic tea from the merchants he had known in Italy, other times arriving empty-handed save for his conversation, which she had come to treasure above any material offering, their talks ranging from agricultural innovations to philosophy, to the shocking novels they both secretly enjoyed. And she found herself opening like a flower beneath consistent sunlight, each day loosening another petal of the protective shell she had built over 10 years of disappointment, until even Harriet had commented on the change, noting with wonder how Eleanor's eyes had regained a sparkle long dimmed, how her laugh came more readily, how she moved through rooms with a grace born of being truly seen rather than perpetually overlooked. And on Tuesday they had walked through Hyde Park, where the cherry blossoms created a canopy of pink snow, Frederick pointing out how the petals caught in her hair like tiny promises while she explained her theories about soil improvement, finding him genuinely fascinated by topics that would send most gentlemen fleeing, and when a sudden shower had driven them to seek shelter beneath a massive oak. They had stood so close she could count the gold flecks in his dark eyes, the moment stretching taut between them, until Lord Pembroke had appeared with his umbrella, shattering the spell but not the warmth that lingered in her chest. And then there was the bookshop on Bond Street, where Frederick had discovered her weakness for Gothic romances, teasing her gently about her taste while purchasing the entire set she had been eyeing longingly. and in the dim light between the towering shelves, he had backed her against the poetry section, his hand braced beside her head as he leaned close enough that she could feel his breath against her cheek, whispering that he had found a first edition of Wollstonecraft that he thought she might enjoy. The words themselves less significant than the way his voice dropped to that particular register that made her pulse race, and they might have kissed there among the dusty volumes if the shop clerk hadn't chosen that moment to inquire if they needed assistance, sending them apart like guilty children, though the heat in Frederick's eyes suggested he was anything but sorry for the near impropriety. And through it all, society watched with avid interest, some matrons beginning to nod approvingly at what they now termed a mature attachment, while others, led by Lady Beatrice, continued to whisper about ulterior motives and inevitable disappointment. But Eleanor found their opinions mattering less with each passing day as Frederick proved his constancy, not through grand gestures, but through the accumulation of small attentions, remembering how she took her tea, noticing when she had been working too long at her accounts by the way she rubbed her temples, bringing her spectacles cleaner from Germany that actually worked unlike the English version she had been using, and perhaps most tellingly, engaging her father in discussions about estate management that somehow always led to showcasing Eleanor's expertise, until even oblivious Sir Thomas had begun to look at his eldest daughter with new appreciation. And when Eleanor had attempted to teach Frederick about crop rotation in the Ashworth drawing room, using salt cellars and spoons to represent different fields, he had listened with such focused attention that she forgot to be self-conscious about her enthusiasm. And when she looked up from her makeshift demonstration, she found him watching her with an expression of such tender admiration that her explanation faltered, and he had reached across the table to capture her hand, threading their fingers together as naturally as if they had been doing it for years rather than days. And in moments like those, Eleanor felt the last of her defenses crumbling, the careful walls she had built against hope, proving no match for the patient siege of a man who seemed to find her knowledge as attractive as other men found batting eyelashes, who valued her opinions as much as her presence, who looked at her spectacles and ink-stained fingers and saw not flaws to be overlooked, but details that made her uniquely herself. And as April drew toward its close with the promise of May sunshine, Eleanor caught herself humming while reviewing accounts, smiling at nothing in particular, and even daring to dream of a future that just 1 month ago had seemed as impossible as flying to the moon, all because one rogue duke had asked a spinster to dance, and then decided she was worth pursuing properly, consistently, with all the dedication he might have once applied to his dissolute pursuits, but now channeled into the revolutionary act of courting a woman for her mind as much as her heart. The 1st of May dawned bright and warm as Eleanor stood before her looking-glass, adjusting the yellow primrose tucked into her hair, while Agnes Fleming fussed with the ribbons of her new morning dress, a soft green muslin that Frederick had mentioned suited her colouring during one of their walks. Though she had pretended not to notice his observation at the time, and now as she prepared for what had become their daily afternoon meeting, she felt the familiar flutter of anticipation mixed with lingering disbelief that this courtship had continued for over 2 weeks without faltering, without him growing bored or distracted as she had initially feared he must. And when the clock struck 3, she was already in the drawing room, ostensibly reading but actually listening for his footsteps on the front stairs, a sound she had memorized as surely as she knew the pattern of rainfall on the estate's fields. And today he arrived with Lord Philip Langdon in tow, an unexpected addition that made her momentarily uncertain until Frederick's warm smile assured her this was planned, not an excuse to dilute their time together. And as the men settled into chairs, Philip studied her with frank curiosity before declaring, "So you are the woman who has managed to domesticate our wild duke," his tone teasing but not unkind, as Frederick shot him a warning look that made Eleanor suppress a smile. "I merely wondered if Miss Ashworth might consent to showing us both the improvements she mentioned to the tenant cottages," Frederick interjected smoothly, as Philip has been dealing with similar issues on his own estate. And Eleanor felt a rush of pleasure that he had not only remembered her casual mention of the cottage renovations, but had thought to share her expertise with his friend. And soon they were walking through the London streets toward the mews where Frederick kept his carriage, Philip regaling them with stories of Frederick's Italian escapades that painted a picture of a man running from pain rather than toward pleasure, though he couched the tales in humour. And Eleanor found herself laughing at the image of Frederick attempting to learn vineyard management from bemused Italian farmers who spoke no English, while Frederick protested that his Italian was perfectly serviceable, thank you very much, and the ease between the three of them felt natural, unforced, as if she had always been part of their circle rather than an outsider looking in. And when they reached the construction site where she had convinced her father to invest in proper drainage and ventilation for the worker cottages, she forgot her self-consciousness entirely as she explained the principles behind the improvements, using technical terms that would have sent most ladies fleeing, but which had both men leaning in with genuine interest. And she caught Frederick watching her with that particular expression she had begun to recognize, a mixture of admiration and something deeper that made her pulse quicken, even as she discussed lime mortar and load-bearing walls. And when Philip asked a particularly insightful question about cost management, she answered eagerly, pulling out the small notebook she always carried to show him the figures, not noticing how Frederick's hand had come to rest on the small of her back, in a gesture both protective and possessive, though Philip's raised eyebrow suggested he had marked it well. And as they toured the partially completed cottages, Eleanor felt the rightness of this moment, of being valued for her knowledge rather than despite it, of having her work seen as worthwhile rather than an embarrassing eccentricity. And when a worker approached with a question about the window placements, she answered with confident authority, missing the look that passed between the two men behind her, Philip's expression shifting from skepticism to understanding, as he watched his friend track Eleanor's every movement with barely concealed devotion. And later, as they returned to the carriage, Philip excused himself, claiming another engagement, but not before pressing Eleanor's hand and saying quietly, "I see now why Frederick speaks of little else these days, Miss Ashworth, and I hope you know you have my full support," the words carrying weight beyond their surface meaning, as she glanced at Frederick, who had suddenly become fascinated with adjusting his gloves. And as Philip departed, leaving them alone beside the carriage, Frederick helped her inside with particular care, his hand lingering on hers as he said, "Thank you for sharing your work with us today, though I confess I had an ulterior motive beyond Philip's education." And when she raised a questioning brow, he continued, "I wanted him to see what I see, to understand why I have been, as he puts it, quite desperately boring about you these past weeks," the admission making her cheeks warm as he settled beside her in the carriage, closer than strictly proper. And as they rode back through the bustling streets, Eleanor felt the solid warmth of his presence like a promise. The easy way he had integrated her into his life, suggesting a future she was only just beginning to believe might be possible. While outside, the May sunshine blessed London with unseasonable warmth, and the flower sellers called their wares, and life continued its ancient dance, though for Eleanor the world had narrowed to the space of this carriage, and the man beside her who had somehow made her visible, not just to himself but to others, who had taken her work and her worth and held them up to the light for all to see, declaring them valuable by the simple act of his sustained and public attention. The May Day festivities had drawn most of society to Hyde Park for the traditional celebrations, leaving the usually crowded paths of Green Park blessedly empty as Eleanor walked beside Frederick in the late afternoon sunshine, their steps matching naturally as they had begun to do over these past weeks of courtship, though she still felt a small thrill each time his arm brushed hers, or when he guided her around a puddle with that particular attentiveness that suggested she was precious to him. And today he seemed unusually quiet, his typical sardonic commentary replaced by a thoughtful silence that made her wonder what occupied his mind as they passed beneath the flowering hawthorn trees that scattered white petals like nature's own confetti, until finally she could bear the suspense no longer and asked if something troubled him, watching as he paused mid-stride to turn toward her with an expression so serious it made her heart skip. "Nothing troubles me precisely," he said slowly, "except perhaps that I find myself wanting to share something with you that I have told no one else in England, not even Philip." And the weight of this admission settled between them as he guided her to a secluded bench beneath an ancient elm, sitting closer than propriety strictly allowed, though the park's emptiness afforded them rare privacy, and Eleanor felt her pulse quicken as he removed his gloves with deliberate care before taking her hands in his, the bare skin contact still shocking in its intimacy, even after weeks of growing familiarity. "8 years ago," he began, his voice low and careful, as if the words themselves might wound, "I believed myself in love with Lady Lydia Sinclair, believed it with all the passionate certainty of youth and inexperience." And Eleanor forced herself to remain still, though the mention of his former fiancée sent an unexpected spike of jealousy through her chest. "We were engaged for 3 months, during which time I was foolish enough to share everything with her, my hopes, my fears, even my mother's death when I was 12, and how it had left me feeling untethered." His hands tightened slightly on hers as he continued, "I thought such vulnerability was what love demanded, what it deserved." And the bitterness that crept into his tone made Eleanor ache for the younger man he had been. "The night before our engagement ball, I found her in the conservatory with the Duke of Clarence, a man 20 years her senior, but with twice my fortune, and she did not even have the grace to appear ashamed." He laughed, but the sound held no humor. "She simply looked at me with those cold blue eyes and said that surely I understood a woman must be practical about her future, that my romantic notions were charming but hardly sufficient foundation for a marriage." And Eleanor felt her own experiences of dismissal and invisibility pale beside this deliberate cruelty, this calculated betrayal of trust. "I left England the next morning," Frederick continued, "spent 8 years convincing myself that emotions were weakness, that caring was the province of fools, became the rogue everyone now whispers about because it was easier to be thought dissolute than destroyed." And now his eyes met hers with an intensity that stole her breath. "Until I saw you on that terrace, magnificent in your solitude, refusing to simper or beg for attention, wearing your intelligence like armor and your loneliness like a crown, and I realized I had been running from the wrong thing all along." His thumb traced circles on her palm as he spoke, each movement sending shivers up her arm. "I was not wrong to feel deeply. Lydia was wrong to feel nothing, and you, Eleanor, you feel everything, but have learned to hide it so well that most people never bother to look beneath the surface." And she found herself trembling at the accuracy of his observation, at being so thoroughly seen and understood. "The reason I tell you this," he said, leaning closer until she could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes, "is because I need you to understand that when I say I have no interest in games, when I appear at your door each day, when I defend you against society's ignorance, it is not from boredom or curiosity or some desire to shock the tone." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "It is because you have reminded me that feeling deeply is not weakness but strength, that choosing to hope after disappointment is the greatest courage of all, and I find myself wanting to be brave again, but only if you will be brave with me." And Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at this unexpected vulnerability from a man who wore cynicism like a shield, understanding now that they were both wounded creatures trying to trust again, and without conscious thought, she lifted their joined hands to press a kiss to his knuckles, feeling him inhale sharply at the gesture. "I have been brave every day for 10 years," she whispered against his skin. "But it was the brittle bravery of mere endurance, of surviving rather than living." She raised her eyes to meet his, finding them suspiciously bright. "You make me want to be brave in a different way, Frederick, the kind that hopes for joy rather than simply avoiding pain." And for a long moment they sat in perfect stillness, two souls recognizing themselves in each other across the divide of past hurt, until somewhere in the distance a church bell chimed the hour and broke the spell. Though as they rose to continue their walk, something fundamental had shifted between them, a mutual acknowledgement that whatever they were building together was real and worth fighting for, worth risking the kind of pain they had both learned to fear. And as they made their way back toward Mayfair, with the setting sun painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Eleanor realized that for the first time in a decade, she was not merely allowing herself to be courted, but was actively choosing to fall in love, terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Lady Beatrice Montague had always prided herself on her ability to control the social currents of London society, and the sight of Eleanor Ashworth entering the Westbrook musicale on the Duke of Somerton's arm represented an intolerable disruption to the natural order of things, a challenge that could not go unanswered, particularly when the Duke's attentions had grown so marked that even the gossip columns had begun to take notice, speculating about the unlikely attachment between the most eligible bachelor in England and a woman who had been relegated to the margins of society for a full decade. And as Lady Beatrice watched them from her position near the pianoforte, noting how Frederick bent his head to catch something Eleanor said, how his hand lingered at the small of her back as he guided her to their seats, she felt her carefully maintained composure crack slightly, because this was not how the world was meant to work. Plain spinsters did not capture dukes, and men like Somerton did not look at women like Eleanor Ashworth as if they held the secrets of the universe in their ink-stained fingers. Yet there he sat, ignoring the beautiful Pemberton twins who had positioned themselves strategically nearby, his attention wholly focused on Eleanor as she spoke animatedly about something that made him laugh, a genuine sound that Lady Beatrice had never heard from him in all his years of moving through society with sardonic detachment. And it was this authenticity that disturbed her most, the suggestion that what existed between them was real rather than some elaborate joke or temporary madness. And so she began her campaign in earnest, moving through the room like a general marshalling troops, dropping poisoned words into willing ears about Eleanor's age, her plainness, her presumption in accepting the Duke's attentions, reminding everyone of her father's declining fortune, and questioning what possible appeal she could hold for a man who had sampled the beauties of the continent. And she found ready allies in mothers with marriageable daughters who saw Eleanor's unexpected success as a threat to the established rules that governed their world, rules that said beauty and youth and accomplishment should triumph, not quiet intelligence and faded looks and the ability to manage an estate. And as the soprano began her first aria, Lady Beatrice positioned herself where she could observe her quarry, noting with satisfaction how Eleanor seemed uncomfortable with the attention their entrance had generated, how she kept her eyes fixed on the performer rather than meeting the curious gazes directed her way. And this vulnerability gave Lady Beatrice the opening she needed, for after the intermission she managed to draw Frederick away on the pretense of introducing him to a visiting Italian count who shared his interest in classical literature, leaving Eleanor momentarily alone and exposed to the whispers that immediately arose in his absence, whispers that Lady Beatrice had seeded so carefully about fortune hunters and desperate spinsters and the lengths to which some women would go to escape their fate. And she watched with satisfaction as Eleanor's shoulders tensed, as her hands clenched in her lap, while she pretended not to hear the deliberately audible speculation about whether the Duke's interest was genuine or merely the whim of a man amusing himself with novelty. And when Mrs. Pemberton remarked loudly enough for half the room to hear that it was cruel of gentlemen to raise false hopes in women who should have reconciled themselves to their situation. Eleanor's face flushed, but she kept her gaze steady on the returning performers, though Lady Beatrice could see the effort it cost her, could see the old wounds being torn open by each carefully aimed barb. And this was precisely what she had intended, to remind Eleanor Ashworth of her place, to make the gulf between her and the Duke so apparent that she would retreat of her own accord rather than face continued humiliation. But what Lady Beatrice had not anticipated was Frederick's awareness of the social currents in the room, his quick recognition of Eleanor's distress when he returned to find her isolated and under siege, and the cold fury that flashed in his eyes as he resumed his seat was directed not at Eleanor, but at those who had dared to hurt her, his subsequent actions deliberate and unmistakable as he took Eleanor's hand in full view of the assembly, raising it to his lips in a gesture that went beyond courtesy into declaration, his voice carrying clearly as he said, "Forgive my absence, my dear, though I see it has given the gossips their evening's entertainment." And the emphasis he placed on the endearment, the possessive way he tucked her hand into the crook of his arm, sent a clear message that Lady Beatrice had overplayed her hand, that her attempts to separate them had only served to push the Duke into a more public display of his intentions, and as the music resumed, Frederick kept Eleanor's hand in his, a shocking breach of propriety that he seemed to embrace precisely because it would be talked about, and Lady Beatrice realized with growing alarm that she had miscalculated badly, that in trying to shame Eleanor into retreat, she had instead provoked the Duke into staking his claim more definitively than any mere courtship rituals would have done, and the look he gave Lady Beatrice over Eleanor's head was a warning that she had made an enemy of a man with power and influence far exceeding her own. A man who had spent 8 years learning to survive outside society's approval, and who clearly valued Eleanor Ashworth more than he valued the good opinion of the ton. And as the final notes of the aria faded, and the assembled company rose to adjourn for refreshments, Frederick's voice carried once more as he said to Eleanor, but pitched for others to hear, "I find the air has grown rather close in here. Shall we take a turn in the garden before exposing ourselves to more of society's dubious charms?" And the way Eleanor looked up at him then, gratitude and growing trust mingling in her expression despite the evening's cruelties, told Lady Beatrice that her campaign had not only failed but had accomplished the opposite of what she intended, driving the unlikely couple closer together through shared adversity, teaching them that they were stronger together than apart. And as they made their exit, Eleanor's head held high despite the whispers that followed their progress, Lady Beatrice understood that she had lost this battle decisively, though she was not yet ready to concede the war. The morning of May 3rd, 1814, dawned with unseasonable warmth that drew Eleanor into the garden behind the Ashworth townhouse well before the fashionable hour for calls, her hands deep in the soil as she tended the struggling roses that had been her mother's pride before neglect, and limited funds had reduced them to these few hardy survivors, and she found a peculiar peace in this simple work that required no words or performances or careful navigation of social expectations, just the honest exchange between earth and plant and human care, which was why Frederick's voice startled her so thoroughly when it came from the garden gate. "I should have known to find you here rather than in the drawing-room," causing her to spin around, still kneeling in the dirt, her morning dress already smudged and her hair escaping its simple arrangement. Mortification flooding through her at being caught in such a state by the Duke of Somerton, who stood there in his perfectly tailored coat looking every inch the aristocrat, while she resembled nothing so much as a gardener's assistant, but his expression held no censure, only that warm amusement she had come to treasure over these weeks of courtship as he stepped into the garden uninvited but clearly welcome. "I apologize for the early hour, but I have something particular to discuss and thought perhaps we might speak more freely here than under your sister's watchful eye." And Eleanor rose hastily, brushing at her skirts in a futile attempt to restore some dignity, while acutely aware of the dirt beneath her fingernails and the smudge she could feel on her cheek. "Your Grace, I was not expecting. That is, Harriet is still abed, and my father." But he waved away her stammered explanations as he moved closer, his eyes scanning the garden with genuine interest before returning to her face. "Eleanor, we have known each other for 7 weeks now," and the use of her given name without permission sent a thrill through her, even as she noticed the unusual tension in his shoulders. "During which time you have shown me more genuine companionship than I found in 8 years of wandering the continent, taught me about agricultural innovation with a passion that makes even crop rotation fascinating, challenged my assumptions about everything from poetry to politics, and made me laugh more than I believed possible after." He paused, that shadow of old pain flickering across his features before he continued. "And through it all, you have asked nothing of me, expected nothing, as if my mere presence in your life was gift enough when in truth it is I who have been given the gift." And Eleanor felt her heart beginning to race as she recognized something momentous approaching, her dirty hands forgotten as Frederick reached into his coat to withdraw a small velvet box that made her breath catch. "I had planned something more formal, more proper, but standing here watching you tend these roses with such care, seeing you as you truly are without society's masks or expectations, I find I cannot wait another moment." And then, to her utter astonishment, the Duke of Somerton dropped to one knee right there in her neglected garden, heedless of the damp earth that would surely stain his perfectly creased trousers, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made the rest of the world fade away. "Eleanor Ashworth, you have spent 10 years believing yourself invisible, unwanted, relegated to the margins of a world too blind to see your worth. But I see you, have seen you from that first moment on the terrace when you refused to simper or beg for my attention, and what I see is the woman I want beside me for whatever years God grants us. Not because you would make her adequate duchess or because society expects me to marry, but because you have reminded me how to hope, how to trust, how to believe that love is not weakness, but the greatest strength we possess." His voice roughened with emotion as he opened the box to reveal not the ostentatious diamond she might have expected, but a simple sapphire surrounded by seed pearls that somehow perfectly captured her quiet elegance. "I am not an easy man, Eleanor. I carry scars that sometimes make me sharp when I should be soft, suspicious when I should trust. But you navigate my difficult moods with grace and meet my cynicism with gentle humor that dissolves my defenses, and I find that I do not want to face another day without knowing you will be there to remind me that the world contains more light than shadow." And Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face as this proud, complex man knelt before her, offering not just a ring, but his vulnerabilities, his fears, his carefully guarded heart. "Will you marry me? Not because it is practical or expected or socially advantageous, but because somewhere between that first dance and this morning, I fell completely, irrevocably in love with you, and I believe, dare to hope, that you might feel something similar for me." And Eleanor sank to her knees in front of him, not caring that her skirts would be ruined, or that this was highly improper, needing to meet him on equal ground for this most important moment of her life, her voice trembling but certain as she reached out to cup his face between her earth-stained hands. "Frederick Ravenscroft, you impossible, wonderful man, you have given me more than you know, made me visible not just to society but to myself, reminded me that I am more than my failures and disappointments, that I deserve to be chosen not as a last resort, but as a first choice. And yes, yes, 1,000 times yes, I will marry you, not for your title or your wealth or even your library, though that is a considerable inducement." And here they both laughed through their tears. "But because you see me truly, and somehow find me worth seeing, because you make me brave enough to believe in tomorrow, and because I love you with a depth that terrifies and exhilarates me in equal measure." And as he slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that shook slightly, she added with a watery smile, "Though I should warn you that you are proposing to a woman who will always have dirt under her fingernails and ink stains on her fingers." And his response was to pull her into his arms right there in the garden. Propriety be damned! His kiss tasting of promise and forever. While around them the struggling roses seemed to bloom a little brighter, as if nature itself blessed this union between two souls who had found their way through loneliness and loss to this moment of perfect understanding. And when they finally drew apart, both disheveled and dirt-stained and radiantly happy, Frederick helped her to her feet with a grin that transformed his usually sardonic features. "Shall we go inform your father that his daughter is about to become a duchess? Though I suspect he will be more interested in discussing the agricultural possibilities of my estates." And Eleanor laughed, the sound bright and free in the morning air, her hand secure in his as they turned toward the house and their future, ready to face whatever society might say about this unlikely match between a rogue duke and a spinster who had never quite given up hope. The news of Eleanor Ashworth's engagement to the Duke of Somerton spread through London society like wildfire on that warm May morning, carried from drawing room to drawing room by breathless matrons who could scarcely credit that the notorious rogue duke had offered for a 30-year-old spinster with neither beauty nor fortune to recommend her, and by tea-time the betting books at White's had been updated with wagers on whether the wedding would actually take place, or if his grace would come to his senses before committing such an incomprehensible act. While at the Ashworth townhouse itself, a steady stream of visitors arrived to offer congratulations that ranged from genuine pleasure to barely concealed bewilderment, and Eleanor found herself the center of attention she had neither sought nor knew how to manage, sitting in the drawing-room in her best afternoon dress while Harriet fielded callers with a satisfaction that bordered on smugness, declaring to anyone who would listen that she had always known her dear sister possessed hidden depths that only required the right gentleman to appreciate them, though Eleanor noticed how even Harriet occasionally shot her puzzled glances as if trying to understand how this miracle had occurred. And through it all, Eleanor felt as if she were watching someone else's life unfold. Surely it could not be real that Frederick Ravenscroft had knelt in her garden that morning and offered her his heart along with his ancient title. Surely she would wake to find it had all been a dream born of too much wine and wishful thinking. But then Agnes would appear with another bouquet from Frederick, or a note in his bold hand reminding her that he would call at 4 to take her driving in the park, and the sapphire on her finger would catch the light with reassuring solidity, and she would remember the look in his eyes as he had said he loved her, not with the poetry of a young man's first passion, but with the steady certainty of someone who had lived long enough to know the difference between infatuation and the real thing. And it was this quality that gave her courage when Lady Pembroke arrived with her daughter to offer congratulations so syrupy sweet they could have been poured over pudding, their eyes scanning Eleanor's modest appearance, as if searching for the enchantment that had ensnared the Duke, finding nothing but the same plain features and unfashionable spectacles that had rendered her invisible for a decade. And Eleanor met their scrutiny with a composure she had not known she possessed, understanding finally that she owed them no explanation for Frederick's choice, because love was not a matter of deserving or earning through beauty or accomplishment, but simply of being seen and chosen by someone whose vision penetrated beneath surfaces to the soul beneath. And when Lady Pembroke ventured to suggest that his Grace's proposal had been rather sudden, and perhaps Eleanor might wish to consider a long engagement to be certain of his continued attachment, Eleanor found herself smiling with genuine amusement rather than taking offense, replying that the Duke seemed quite certain of his own mind, and she saw no reason to doubt him simply because others found his choice surprising. And the flash of frustration in Lady Pembroke's eyes told Eleanor that she had won this small skirmish in what would likely be a longer campaign, for society did not easily accept disruptions to its careful hierarchies, and a duke marrying a nobody challenged too many comfortable assumptions about how the world should work. But Eleanor found she cared less about society's opinion than she had ever imagined possible. Perhaps because Frederick's certainty was contagious, or perhaps because, having spent so long on the margins, she had learned to find her worth in places other than ballroom approval. And when 4 o'clock arrived, bringing Frederick himself to the door, still slightly dishevelled from their morning encounter, but radiating a satisfaction that transformed his usually sardonic features, Eleanor felt the room shift, as if his presence had changed the very air, watched how Lady Pembroke's manner altered from condescension to careful courtesy, observed how even Harriet sat a bit straighter, and understood with sudden clarity the power that would soon be hers by association, a power she had no desire for, except as it might allow her to protect those she loved and pursue the interests that truly mattered to her. And as Frederick crossed to her side, his hand extended to help her rise, his dark eyes holding that particular warmth he seemed to reserve only for her, she felt the doubts that had plagued her all afternoon dissolve like morning mist, because this was real. This impossible, wonderful, terrifying thing was actually happening. And she was brave enough to embrace it, despite the whispers and the wagering and the certainty in some quarters that the Duke of Somerton would surely regret choosing affection over advantage. And as she placed her hand in his and felt his fingers close around hers with gentle possession, she caught sight of their reflection in the mirror above the mantel. An ordinary woman and an extraordinary man who somehow looked exactly right together, and her last coherent thought before he led her out to his waiting carriage was that perhaps visibility was not about being seen by everyone, but about being truly seen by the one person whose opinion mattered most. The drive through Hyde Park that afternoon of May 3rd, 1814, should have been a triumph. Eleanor's first public appearance as the acknowledged fiancé of the Duke of Somerton, and indeed the heads that turned as Frederick's elegant barouche passed along the fashionable paths told her that society had received the news and was eager to observe this most unexpected pairing. But Eleanor found she cared remarkably little for the stares and whispers that followed them, too absorbed in the simple pleasure of sitting beside Frederick, with his hand occasionally brushing hers, too aware of the sapphire ring that caught the afternoon light each time she moved, and when they passed Lady Beatrice Montague walking with her daughter, the older woman's expression of barely concealed fury was so pronounced that Eleanor might have laughed if she had been a less charitable person. Instead, she merely inclined her head with the graciousness expected of her new station, while Frederick's sardonic smile suggested he found the encounter equally amusing. And later, when they stopped to walk along a quieter path, he told her that Lady Beatrice had called on him that very morning, attempting to convince him that Eleanor was a fortune hunter, despite having no fortune to hunt, and that she had been seen behaving improperly with various gentlemen, which was such a transparent lie that Frederick had laughed in her face before showing her the door, and Eleanor felt a surge of gratitude, not for his defence, which she had not needed, but for his absolute certainty in her character that made such accusations seem absurd rather than threatening. And she told him so, watching his expression soften, in that way it only did when they were alone, and he replied that anyone who could not see her worth within 5 minutes of conversation was too foolish to merit consideration, adding with a lightness that did not quite hide the depth beneath that he had spent 8 years believing himself unworthy of love after Lady Lydia's betrayal, and Eleanor had shown him the error of that thinking simply by being herself. And Eleanor stopped walking then, there on the path with the spring leaves rustling overhead and the distant sounds of other promenaders creating a backdrop of genteel normalcy. And she turned to face him with all the earnestness her heart could hold, telling him that she had spent 10 years believing herself invisible and unlovable, and he had proven her wrong, not through grand gestures, but through the simple, consistent act of seeing her, choosing her, showing up day after day as if her company were the most natural thing in the world, rather than an act of charity or rebellion. And she watched his dark eyes grow bright with emotion. He did not attempt to hide, watched him raise her hand to his lips and press a kiss to her knuckles that lingered longer than strict propriety allowed. And when he spoke, his voice was rough with feeling, as he said that she had given him something far more precious than she knew, not just her love but her trust, offered freely despite every reason to guard her heart, and that he would spend the rest of his life proving worthy of that gift. And Eleanor believed him, believed in this future that had seemed so impossible just 7 weeks ago, believed that the girl who had retreated to the terrace in quiet desperation had somehow found her way to this moment of perfect belonging, and as they resumed their walk with their fingers intertwined beneath the cover of her shawl, she understood that this was what it meant to be truly seen, not the superficial recognition of beauty or status that society valued, but the deep knowing of soul, recognizing soul. And she smiled with a joy that transformed her plain features into something luminous, something that made Frederick catch his breath and whisper that she was the most beautiful woman he had ever known. And for the first time in her life, Eleanor Ashworth believed it. The wedding of Eleanor Ashworth to Frederick Ravenscroft, Duke of Somerton, took place on May 15, 1814, in the small stone church at Hertfordshire, where generations of Ashworths had been christened, married, and mourned, and if society had expected the Duke to insist upon a grand London ceremony, befitting his station, they were disappointed to learn that he had instead deferred entirely to his bride's preference for the country chapel where her mother lay buried, and where the ancient Ashworth oak was visible through the eastern windows. And Eleanor stood at the altar in a gown of ivory silk that Harriet had insisted upon ordering from the finest modiste in London, her mother's pearls gleaming at her throat as they had at every significant moment of her life, her spectacles firmly in place because Frederick had told her he wished to see her exactly as she was, and not some blurred, romantic version she thought he might prefer. And as she spoke her vows, her voice was steady, with a certainty she had never expected to feel, watching Frederick's dark eyes hold hers with an intensity that made the rest of the congregation fade into insignificance. And when the vicar pronounced them man and wife, Frederick raised her hand to his lips with the same deliberate tenderness he had shown on the terrace 7 weeks ago. Only now the gesture carried the weight of permanent belonging rather than tentative hope. And afterward, at the wedding breakfast held at Ashworth House, the guests numbered fewer than 50, an intimate gathering that Lady Beatrice Montague had pointedly declined to attend, citing a prior engagement that fooled no one. But Eleanor found she did not miss the society matron's presence, too busy receiving congratulations from Agnes Fleming, whose eyes were suspiciously bright, from her father, Sir Thomas, who seemed genuinely pleased, though still somewhat bewildered by the speed of events, from Lord Philip Langdon, who kissed her hand and declared Frederick the luckiest man in England, and from Harriet, who had wept through the entire ceremony, and now clung to Eleanor's arm, declaring that she had always known her sister was destined for great things, even when Eleanor herself had abandoned all hope. And through it all, Frederick remained at her side, his hand finding hers beneath the table during the toasts, his smile holding that particular warmth he reserved only for her. And when at last they departed for Somerton Hall, where they would spend their honeymoon, the spring afternoon was golden with promise, the carriage rolling through countryside bursting with new growth, and Eleanor leaned her head against her husband's shoulder and felt the last remnants of her old self, the resigned spinster who had believed herself invisible and unlovable, dissolve like morning frost under the sun, replaced by this new creature she was still learning to recognize, a woman who was seen and chosen and cherished, a duchess who had arrived at her title not through beauty or fortune or family connection, but through the simple miracle of being truly known by someone whose opinion mattered more than all the ballrooms in London. And as Somerton Hall came into view, its ancient stone walls glowing amber in the late light, Frederick pressed a kiss to her hair and murmured, "Welcome home." And Eleanor Ashworth Ravenscroft, Duchess of Somerton, smiled with a joy that illuminated her plain features into something radiant, understanding at last that home was not a place, but a person, and she had finally, impossibly, wonderfully found hers. The years that followed their wedding unfolded like the pages of a book Eleanor had never dared to imagine herself worthy of reading, and as she sat in the library of Somerton Hall on a golden afternoon in September of 1819, more than 5 years after that fateful terrace encounter, she watched her daughter Charlotte toddle across the carpet toward the window where Frederick sat reading, his dark hair now touched with silver at the temples, though his eyes held the same warmth they had shown when he first asked her to dance. And Eleanor felt the familiar surge of wonder that had never quite faded despite the comfortable rhythms of their life together. This sense that she had somehow stumbled into a fairy tale meant for someone else, only to discover it had been written for her all along, and little Charlotte, who had inherited her father's dark curls and her mother's sharp, observant eyes behind tiny spectacles that made Frederick laugh with delight every time he saw them, climbed into his lap with the determination of a child who knew herself utterly beloved, and Frederick set aside his book to receive her with the patient tenderness that still surprised Eleanor after all these years, this man whom society had called a rogue and a rake proving himself the most devoted of fathers, reading to Charlotte from the same Italian Dante he had once given Eleanor, though the child understood none of the words, and cared only for the music of his voice and the security of his arms. And Eleanor thought of all the ballrooms where she had stood invisible, all the whispered cruelties she had endured, all the nights she had lain awake convinced that love was a country whose borders would forever be closed to her. And she understood now that those years of waiting had not been wasted, but had instead shaped her into someone capable of recognizing true worth when it appeared, someone who would not be fooled by surfaces or seduced by mere charm, someone who could see the wounded heart beneath Frederick's sardonic smile and offer it the safe harbor it had sought for so long. And when Frederick looked up and caught her watching them, his smile held that particular quality of intimate understanding that made her feel known down to her very soul, and he said softly that their daughter had her mother's love of books and her father's stubbornness, a combination that would surely terrify her future governesses, and Eleanor laughed with the easy joy of a woman who had learned that happiness was not a destination, but a daily choice, a practice of gratitude and presence that transformed ordinary moments into treasures, and she crossed the room to join them, settling into the space Frederick made for her at his side, her hand finding his as Charlotte babbled contentedly between them. And in that moment, Eleanor Ashworth Ravenscroft understood that the girl who had retreated to the terrace in despair had not disappeared, but had instead grown into this woman, this wife, this mother, this duchess who had found her place not by changing who she was, but by finally being seen for exactly that. And she hoped that somewhere, somehow, another woman who believed herself invisible might take heart from the knowledge that it is never too late for the story to change, never too late for hope to bloom in the most unexpected of gardens.